the Valley of Elah, or the Valley of Elah, which is the story where David and Goliath took place. But there's, I've told you that when you better understand the world of the Bible, you'll better comprehend the words of the Bible. And I talked to you about the goal of, I want you to be able to, when you hear some, for most of us, because the biblical world is at least 2,000 years separated from us, and thousands of miles separated from us, and we've never been here, our minds fly through biblical cities really fast. So the goal is just to break some of that down, but there'll be 10 or 20 cities that when you start reading them, you'll say, got it, I've heard it. And Lachish is one of the most common Old Testament cities mentioned. And so, yeah, and we're going to talk about Lachish more when we get into Jerusalem because it's very, very significant. But if you have a Bible, turn to 1 Samuel 17. 1 Samuel 17. I want to walk you through the story of David and Goliath. I'll assume that you're somewhat familiar with it. Even if you're brand new to the Bible, you've heard of David and Goliath. When people in our culture use the expression, David and Goliath, what do they mean by it? What are they talking about?
Mismatch.
Underdog.
A mismatch, yeah, an underdog. Good. So I want to talk to you about two things about this story. Is that I think often Christians get it wrong, and I think sometimes maybe we should at least consider that how the expression David and Goliath, the way we tend to think of it, that there is an underdog and an obvious favorite, may not be as accurate as we assume. And I want to do that through walking you through the story here. So, I mentioned the Philistines were in the coastal plain, so they were, down by the Mediterranean Sea, south, working their way up. Hebron is over there. You've heard of Hebron with Abraham. Beyond that, you have Bethlehem and Jerusalem. You can't see those, but they're over that hill. It was, I don't know, I think it was said when I left Jerusalem today, it was like 15 miles to get here if the roads were straight, and then, but then it's 45 minutes through the windy roads. But as the Philistines are moving north, Saul and his armies hear about this, and they come, and there's kind of just a big standstill here. So let me lay the battlefield out for you. I'm going to read 1 Samuel 17, 1 and 2. You can follow along or just listen. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Soka in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes Damim between Soka and Azekah. So let's figure out where that is. So the Philistines gathered for war and assembled at Soka in Judah, and then they were between two camps, Soka and Azekah. Soka is, you see how that hill of trees comes down, and then there's another hill just right behind it. So you're not looking at the far hill. You're looking at a hill. You see it's kind of a little bare with some rocks there. Do you see what I'm talking about? That's Soka. Azekah is what I pointed out from the bus, which is over there. You see it at the top of the hill?
The flat spot.
Yeah, the flat spot at the top of the hill. So you can imagine the Philistines, that it's somewhere between there. It's kind of like they were circled around this hill a little bit. And then it says, Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the Valley of Elah and drew up their battle lines to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites the other, with a valley between them. And here we are. We are on the Israelite hill. That hill is where the Philistines would have been, and there's a valley between. This site up here is a new discovery. When you're talking 10 or 15 years ago for an archaeological discovery, that's a huge deal. And what's interesting, I just was reading a couple of nights ago, they actually found a broken piece of pottery with scripture on it that they've dated to the 10th century BC. That will become, once that's verified, that will become the oldest written piece of scripture that we have. And it's copied on broken pottery using ink, which is not normal. Usually in broken pottery they'd etch into it. This is with ink. And it has a few phrases from scripture. In other words, and that was found here. That means 10 centuries before Christ, we are at the time of David. And this would have been probably the location that Saul and his army was their main base camp for this significant battle. Okay. So, verse 4. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. That would be 9 foot 9 inches, cubits. The Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, do you follow that? So before the New Testament, scholars got together and they translated Hebrew into Greek as more and more of even Jewish people were speaking the Greek language. Their translation says 4 cubits in a span. That would put him just below 7 feet. So which is it? I don't know. We know in modern times, the tallest man was 8'11". He had giantism, died at the age of 24. Did Goliath have that? I don't know. Was he 9'9"? Was he almost 7 foot? I don't know. He was a big boy. Verse 5. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor and bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. That's 125 pounds. He's wearing in his helmet and body armor. On his legs, he wore bronze greaves. That'd be like shin guards. You think of soccer? Bronze greaves. And a bronze javelin was slung on his back. Can you picture it? Picture this guy, all decked out in armor, even his shins. He's got a javelin behind his back. Verse 7. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. That's 15 pounds. The point of his spear weighed 15 pounds. Verse 8. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle?" So Philistines there, Israelites here. Again, we kind of walked the edge. You can see the edge right there. That's the road we walked on. So were they up here? Were they down there? Maybe some of both. And Goliath yells, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me." A little while ago, I watched a video from this area, and they had one person stand on the top of this hill and one go into the middle of that field, and they could hear them up here from the middle of the field. The acoustics were sufficient enough. And so Goliath is yelling, "Why do you line up for battle? I'm a Philistine. Are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man, have him come down to me." Now, why would Goliath suggest a one-on-one battle? Anyone have a suggestion why that might be the case?
They can't take the city. It's easier to beat one person.
Right, they can't beat the city. So what you have is you've got one army on a high spot here, one army on a high spot there. You may remember from our videos and from the work I gave you beforehand, if you want to defend a city, what's the most important thing? You better have the high ground. So if the Philistines come at them, they're at a disadvantage. If the Israelites go at the Philistines, they're at the disadvantage. So Goliath's idea is, let's just do a one-on-one. We'll solve it that way. If he's able to fight and kill me, we'll become your subjects. But if you overcome me and if I overcome him and kill him, you'll become our subjects. Serve us. Then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. It makes sense. I mean, this is a huge guy, and not one of the armies brave enough. It's terrifying. By the way, I just wish one person from the Israelite army would have said, "Hey, time out. We are not the servants of Saul. We're servants of God." Now, the scene changes to David. Now, David was the son of an Ephraimite. That's the region of Bethlehem, just over that hill. Named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time, he was very old. Jesse's 3 eldest sons followed Saul to war. The firstborn, Eliab, the second, Abinadab, and the third, Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul. But David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistine came forward every morning and every evening and took his stand. He'd come out and he'd say, "I am a Philistine. Are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man and let him come fight me." Every morning, every night, 40 days. Then, verse 17, Jesse said to his son David, take an ephah, that's about 5 gallons, of roasted grain, 10 loaves of bread for your brother, and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are, and bring back some assurance from them. They are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the Valley of Elah, fighting against the Philistines. Early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle position, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. So the Philistines are lined up, the Israelites are lined up on the edge of this hill. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle line. So he ran from up here, perhaps, likely, down to the battle lines at the top of the hill. As he ran to the battle lines and asking his brothers how they were. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath is 6 miles downstream, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. David heard it this time. He's been saying the same thing 40 days, 40 nights. Are you not the servants of Saul? And for the first time, someone's offended by that statement. Then this is crazy, verse 24. When the Israelites saw the man, they fled from him in great fear. You're at the top of the hill, dudes. What are you running into the city walls? I mean, they were really intimidated by this guy. Verse 25. Now the Israelites have been saying, do you see how this man keeps coming out? He keeps coming out to defy Israel. Do you hear it? He keeps coming out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He'll give his daughter in marriage and will exempt his family from taxes in Israel. David asked the man standing near him. By the way, being exempt from taxes in Israel would be a good thing. Where's Adam? Adam, if you buy a car, what do you pay in taxes on that car? Ouch. If it's luxury, what are we talking? Okay. David asked the man, what will be done for the man who kills the Philistine? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of God, the living God? You got to hear that. If you don't hear that twist that David puts in it, it reveals David's heart. It reveals his motive. What did the Philistines say? You're the servants of Saul. What did the Israelites say? He's defying the armies of Israel. And David rightly proclaims he's defying the armies of God, of the living God. Verse 27, they repeated to him what he had been saying, and told him, this is what will be done for the man who kills him. Then there ends up being a little brotherly spat. I love this. Then Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the man, and he burned with anger. Why have you come down here? Whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are, how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle. And David responds, what have I done? Can't I even speak? You can just, if you have a younger brother or an older brother, you see this. And depending on if you're older or younger, it depends on who you think is the jerk here. But, we'll talk about that another time. He then turned away to someone else and brought up the matter. So the little brother's just like, who cares? And he's like, I want to keep talking about this. The men answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul. Saul sent for him. So now David comes to Saul. David said to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go up and fight him. He's a kid. Can you imagine? What kind of fighting are they used to?
Hand-to-hand.
Yeah, hand-to-hand combat. Right? Goliath, right? He's got 125 pounds of armor on. The tip of his spear is 15 pounds. David's thinking differently. Saul replied, verse 33, you are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man. He has been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. Again, notice David's emphasis. He calls him. He calls the Philistine uncircumcised. It's a little bit, Israeli trash talking. And he says he's defied God's servants, not Saul's servants, God's servants. Now notice where his confidence is. Verse 37. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion, the paw of the bear, will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. David's offense was for God, and his confidence was in God. Now, he gets ready. Then Saul dressed David in his tunic, put on a coat of armor, bronze helmet. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around. He wasn't used to them. I can't go in these, he said to Saul. I'm not used to them. He took them off. Verse 40. He took a staff in hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in hand approached the Philistine. So David is now approaching this very, very differently than people typically would think. Now, when we go down, we're going to go down a different way, and I'm going to take you by the stream. There's only one stream that runs the Valley of Elah. And I'll take you to a spot that you could see. And if any of the Zoom meetings you've been in with me on this or any other meeting, you've seen 5 stones sitting on the edge of my desk. That's from this stream down here. And we'll go down there in just a little bit. So I want to suggest as I read this next part of the story, I don't think David got lucky. And I don't think David was as much of an underdog as we might imagine. He just approached the battle from a different perspective. He was so offended for his God. Verse 41, meanwhile the Philistine with his shield bearer in front of him kept coming closer to David. He looked David over, saw he was a little boy, growing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? The Philistine, he's only carrying a staff, no armor. And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Come here, he said, I'll give your flesh to the birds and wild animals. David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin. I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and wild animals, and the whole world will know there is a God in Israel. There's that phrase we just talked about. All those who gathered here will know it is not by sword or spear the Lord saves. The battle is the Lord's. He will give it into our hands. Notice it for David. It was all about God. I think this story is unintentionally misused. And I don't want to say totally misused. I think there's certainly some application on how often it is used. But I do want to suggest that when people often use the story of David and Goliath, they make it about giants in our lives. Like, you've got a difficult relationship, you're suffering with a physical issue, you've lost someone you love. I don't think that's the purpose of this story. Because this story had nothing to do with David and his problems. This story had everything to do with the glory of God and a follower of God who loved his God so much. He hated seeing him defied, and he had to do something. This is not David that has a difficult job, and so that's the giant in his life. And I think when we simplify it so much down to David and Goliath is about the difficulties we face in life, I think it might be a misuse of the story. I think this is a story of a follower of God who loves God so much that he's bothered when he sees his God defied and discarded and not treated with honor. So, as the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag, taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. Can someone look up Judges 20:16 for me and be ready to read it? Who's got it? Who can find it for me?
I can find
Okay, be ready to read it in just a minute. Let's talk about the sling. You probably know it's not a kid's sling like you see with, pulls it back. This is a little pouch with 2, I had one with me last week, but it's a pouch with 2 little ropes or strings on it, and you'd swing it, and then these guys, he became so good, he'd let go of one end, and that rock would be like a rocket coming out of there, 100 miles an hour coming out of that sling. And you think, well, yeah, but how accurate is it? Well, can you read Judges 20:16 for us? Did you find it?
Yes, 2016.
Yeah.
Among all those soldiers, there were 700 chosen men who were left-handed, each of whom could sling a stone at a hair and not miss.
Did you hear that? There are 700 troops that are left-handed. Why are they left-handed? Is it possible they had been injured in battle and no longer could use their right hand? So they began to think about a different type of warfare. And they would be so good with a sling, 700 of these guys, they could hit a hair. That's how accurate they were. So when you think about how accurate that people that practice this, how accurate they could be with a sling, who's the underdog really? I'm not sure it was David. I think the underdog was Goliath. Now, there certainly is a sense because it was unknown. It was not a regular, that wasn't what anybody expected. Saul didn't expect it. I don't know if David initially thought of it because he was going out there in his armor that didn't fit. It didn't work. So I don't think it was a fair fight. But I also don't think God made a miracle happen for David to win this battle. David was prepared for this battle. Verse 50, David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran over, stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword, drew it from its sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. When the Philistines saw their hero dead, they turned and ran. The men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath, to the gates of Ekron. Gath, again, 6 miles downstream around that mountain. Their dead were strewn along the Sharim road to Gath and Ekron. When the Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines, they plundered their camp. David took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem. Can you imagine this teenage boy carrying the head of this giant? He put the Philistine's weapon in his own tent. All right, so let me just talk about this story just a little bit more. I think we make the story about David, and I think ultimately the story is about God and his glory. David's motive was God's glory. Verse 36. Your servant has killed lion and bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them because he's defied the armies of the living God. His motive was God's glory. His dependence was God's strength. Verse 47. All those gathered will know it's not by sword or spear the Lord saves. The battle is the Lord's. He will give all of you into our hands. His motive, God's glory. His dependence, God's strength. The desired result is that people would know and see God's glory. Verse 46. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands. The whole world will know there's a God in Israel. When we make this story that it's about you and a difficult boss, or you and a difficult medical diagnosis, those are really important things, no doubt about it, and they're really important to God. I don't think you should look at that as the Goliath in your life. I think the Goliath in life is whatever is around us that is defying God and who he is and defies who we are as God's people. I think often we are living in a culture that we don't expect people that are without God to live for God, but we don't allow ourselves to be offended for our God. And I think we need as believers to be willing to speak up, to say something when our God is defied. I remember when I worked at Frito-Lay. Frito-Lay, I worked in a warehouse when I was in college and seminary. And I would go into the break room, and, they were what you would expect of guys working in a warehouse. The stories they told, weren't the best of stories. The words they used weren't words I used. I ended up coming with a strategy because they use the Lord's name in vain so often. Frankly, it's always been strange to me, like that the F word is considered the worst word. But saying, oh my God is just no big deal. But saying the F word doesn't defy God. But saying the name Jesus Christ in a meaningless way, taking the Lord's name in vain, it means using it in a meaningless way. Saying, oh my God, just casually, or when someone yells Jesus Christ without referring to him just as an element of surprise. They did that all the time, and I came up with a strategy. I don't know if it's a good one or not. But I was bothered by how they were defying God because he meant so much to me. And part of me just thought, well, they're unbelievers. What else would they do? But to me, they were defying God. So I came up with a strategy whenever they would do it around me. So someone would say, Jesus Christ. And I'd be like, wait, what? Oh, I thought you meant he was here. And they thought it was hilarious, but I would do it every time, and they would get so annoyed with me, they stopped doing it. That was my attempt. There was something in me that was, I don't expect unbelievers to live like believers. I don't expect it. But I still can be offended for my God and his reputation and his glory. And we need to have groups of believers, especially in our culture, where there was a day where living for Christ in our culture, you did kind of blend in because your morality was much like everyone else's morality. That day's gone. And today even, when you say you disagree with certain things because of who God is and what God said, you become the enemy. You've heard me say before that there comes a point in culture where what was persecuted becomes celebrated. And when that happens, what was celebrated becomes persecuted. And if you won't celebrate, you'll become persecuted. And I think more and more in our culture, we do need to apply the story of David and Goliath. But I don't think we need to apply it to giants in our lives, whatever those difficulties are. I think we need to apply it to living surrounded by a culture that doesn't just reject God, but defies him. And would God allow us to live in such a way, to speak so strongly of his glory, to defend him, to speak up for him? I'll talk about this a couple times on the trip. We don't have to know everything, and we don't have to say everything. But I think we need to say something. Even if it's, I don't know that I agree with that. And if they ask and say, what do you mean? Then follow it up. But also, don't forget, it's not your job to defend God. I've often said the Bible's like a lion. Let it out of the cage. It'll be all right. It doesn't need us to defend it. God doesn't need your defense. But there's something about being offended for our God that God honors. And may we be people that trust in him, living in a culture that rejects him, to be able to speak up and say something. The right words, at the right time, in the right moment, in the right spirit, with the right humility, that God would use to glorify himself and make others around say, there's something about that person. There's something unique about him. There's something unique about her. And I just pray that God would allow us to live in such a way that we would bring glory to him and we'd be offended for his glory, so that it forces us to do something, say something.